So our mission today, looking at this honestly massive stack of sources we've gathered for you, is to, well, fundamentally restructure how we understand the collapse of civilizations.
Yeah, it's a big goal.
It is, because the popular imagination, fueled by movies and fiction, it usually gets this completely wrong.
Right.
We picture the end of an empire as this singular, catastrophic event, like a massive explosion.
A definitive apocalyptic battle.
Exactly. Where the gates are breached, the banners fall, and that's it. But the core theme running through the historical analyses, the epidemiological data, and even the theoretical physics we are exploring today is that history does not collapse in a single explosion.
It really doesn't.
It erodes. Civilizations rarely fall because of one battle. They fall when the internal systems that protect life begin to fail.
And that erosion, that's the true engine of historical change because when war begins or a major geopolitical crisis hits, our attention immediately turns to the front lines.
Which makes sense.
Totally makes sense. You watch the troop movements, the tactical strikes, all the immediate visible conflicts that dominate the headlines. But the real damage, the structural damage that actually ends empires, happens behind those front lines.
Right. It occurs when the invisible scaffolding of society just gives way.
Exactly. Water plants stop functioning. Sewage systems leak into the aquifers.
Hospitals lose power as the infections start escalating.
And those sprawling, intricate supply chains that deliver food and medicine, they just fracture. Food becomes scarce.
Children become malnourished.
Yeah, and families crowd into temporary shelters.
And in that exact moment of infrastructural vulnerability, biology takes over.
Yeah.
Because when human-made systems break down, biology never negotiates.
Never.
But to understand how that biological takeover actually happens, we first have to understand the lifespan and the anatomy of the civilizations themselves.
Right, the baseline.
Yeah. So social scientist Luke Kemp provides a really fascinating quantitative baseline in our sources. He analyzed dozens of civilizations across human history.
And he defined a civilization pretty strictly, right?
He did.
Yeah.
He said it has to be a society possessing agriculture, multiple cities, military dominance in its region, and a continuous political structure.
Okay.
And out of all the societies that actually met those criteria, the average lifespan was about 340 years.
Just 340 years.
Yeah.
Which is a remarkably humbling statistic when we consider the permanence we usually project onto our own modern institutions.
We think we're forever.
We always do. But the data shows remarkable extremes on either side of that average, like the Kushite kingdom in Northeast Africa.
Right.
With its deeply integrated trade networks and adaptable agriculture along the Nile, that kingdom lasted an astonishing 1,150 years.
Oh.
The Aksumite Empire in East Africa sustained itself for 1,100 years. The Vedic civilization in South Asia, the Olmecs in Mesoamerica, they each persisted for roughly a millennium.
But then you look at the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, the fast collapses.
Exactly. The Nanda Empire in India, despite its massive wealth and this formidable army, it lasted a mere 24 years.
That's incredible.
Or the Qin dynasty in China. I mean, the very dynasty that initiated the Great Wall and unified the Chinese states lasted only 14 years before fracturing into civil war.
So the obvious question driving our historical sources, particularly the work of Joseph Tanter, is why that disparity exists.
Right. Why do some last 1,000 years and some last a decade?
And Tainter frames societal collapse not as, a sudden stroke of terrible luck or divine retribution. He sees it as a deeply mechanical political process.
The loss of complexity.
Exactly, a rapid loss of sociopolitical complexity. He views human societies as problem-solving organizations.
So when a society faces a challenge,
like a food shortage or a hostile neighbor,
right, its typical response is to increase its complexity.
It creates a new bureaucracy or raises a standing army or builds a more intricate irrigation system.
And initially, that added complexity works. It yields positive return.
It does. But eventually, societies hit a point of declining marginal returns. The cost of simply maintaining all those bureaucracies, armies, and infrastructure begins to severely drain the society's energy and resource base.
It just costs too much to keep the lights on.
Precisely. And when that maintenance cost becomes too high, a civilization becomes incredibly fragile.
And Tainter identifies 3 specific models of societal response that emerge when a civilization hits that point of fragility. The first model he calls the dinosaur.
Which is a great name for
It
it.
really paints a picture.
Yeah.
This describes a large-scale society where resources are being depleted at an exponential, unsustainable rate. But the ruling elite absolutely refuse to adapt.
They just won't change.
Right. They are unwilling, or perhaps structurally unable, to acknowledge the shifting reality of their resource base.
So instead of innovating or changing course, they oppose new solutions. They double down on their existing paradigm.
They commit more and more of their dwindling resources to failing social institutions. They effectively just charge forward right into the tar pit.
Which Tainter contrasts with a second model of vulnerability. He calls this one the runaway train.
A runaway train.
Yeah, and this describes a society whose entire continued function, its very baseline survival, is dependent on constant growth and aggressive acquisition.
Like the Roman Empire.
Exactly. Rome and the Mongol Empire serve as prime historical laboratories for this model. Rome's economy wasn't a closed, self-sustaining loop.
Not at all.
It was heavily propped up by the continuous expansion of its borders, the pillaging of new territories, and the steady influx of enslaved populations to work the massive agricultural estates.
And that model creates a terrifying mathematical inevitability because it just cannot be sustained indefinitely.
It runs out of room.
Right. The moment the runaway train reaches a geographical or military boundary where further conquest is no longer profitable.
Like pushing into the dense forests of Germania.
Or the vast deserts of the East. The forward momentum simply stops. And because that forward momentum was the central organizing principle holding the entire political and economic structure together, the society fractures internally.
The engine tears itself apart when it runs out of track.
That's a great metaphor. Which brings us directly to Tainter's third model, the House of Cards.
This is a fascinating one.
It occurs when a civilization's greatest achievement, its immense complexity, actually becomes its fatal flaw.
Right. A society grows so massive, integrating so many highly complex, deeply interdependent social and economic institutions that it becomes inherently unstable.
Everything is relying on everything else.
Exactly. The system often demands that all social organizations become arms of the government to maintain order. And to sustain this, the system must either stifle all dissent, which paradoxically encourages subversion,
Right.
or it has to exercise significantly less authority than it officially claims to have, which just hollows out its legitimacy.
So in a House of Cards scenario, a disruption in one minor sector just cascades through the entire system. Any slight breeze brings the monumental structure down.
But while Tainter focuses heavily on that internal structural bloat, the sources also pull in the work of Jared Diamond to layer on the external and environmental pressures.
Yeah. Diamond outlines 5 interconnected factors that dictate a civilization's survival or collapse.
First is climate change, and not necessarily global shifts, but microclimatic variations in rainfall or temperature that an overextended agrarian society can no longer absorb.
Second is hostile neighbors. Third is the collapse of essential trading partners, which cuts off vital resource inflows.
Fourth is environmental degradation, things like deforestation, soil depletion, or salinization of agricultural land.
And the fifth factor Diamond emphasizes is perhaps the most critical. It's the society's collective response to those first 4 challenges.
Because a society facing soil depletion and hostile neighbors can actually survive if its political structure remains flexible and its population united.
And this is where the structural theories of Tainter and the environmental theories of Diamond really intersect with demographics.
Yeah, the sources detail how pre-industrial agrarian societies displayed highly predictable population cycles. They typically faced severe internal instability after a century or two of relative peace and sustained economic growth.
Because as the population steadily grows during those peaceful centuries, it inevitably approaches the carrying capacity of its environment.
And its agricultural technology.
Yeah.
But the data shows that population growth alone isn't necessarily enough to trigger a collapse.
Right. If the ruling class remains cohesive and resources are managed efficiently, they can adapt.
The true catalyst for instability is often what demographic dynamics refer to as a youth bulge.
The youth bulge.
Yeah, the mechanics of this are historically lethal. This occurs when there is a significant excess in the young adult male population.
So in a society that has reached its carrying capacity, as these 3rd, 4th, or 5th sons come of age, they find that the system just has no place for them.
The agricultural land is fully parceled out. The bureaucracy is full.
The society cannot realize their economic desires or offer them the elite positions they feel entitled to.
Which creates a massive demographic cohort of disenfranchised, frustrated young adults in their 20s. a group that is historically highly susceptible to radicalization.
So when an angry youth bulge coincides with chronic inflation, political rigidity, and environmental strain, the entire social fabric is placed in jeopardy.
It's a powder keg.
So the historical record gives us civilizations acting as dinosaurs refusing to adapt, runaway trains collapsing when expansion halts, and houses of cards crumbling under bureaucratic weight. We have overtaxed environments and radicalized youth bulges.
And we typically read about the fall of Rome or the Han Dynasty, and we view them purely as political or military events.
We focus on the emperors and the generals.
But the ultimate twist revealed in our sources is that the final nail in the coffin of a civilization is almost never a sword.
No. The final blow is almost always biological.
Oh.
When human infrastructure erodes under the weight of those political and economic failures, disease moves in to finish the job.
And reevaluating history through this biological lens completely changes how we view human conflict. War and political collapse are, at their core, massive systemic destabilizers.
They break down the intricate human-made systems that keep populations safe from the natural world.
And what the epidemiological history shows us with brutal consistency is that after major conflicts, disease has almost always claimed exponentially more lives than the weapons deployed on the battlefield.
The statistical data from our historical sources on this is just staggering. Take the Napoleonic Wars,
Right.
a period we associate with massive infantry squares, cavalry charges, and artillery bombardments. The actual cause of death was overwhelmingly microscopic. For every one British soldier who was killed in combat, 8 died of disease.
An 8-to-1 ratio.
8 to 1. And moving forward to the American Civil War, nearly 700,000 people died. But 2/3 of those dead were not killed by musket fire or cannonballs.
They were slaughtered by what historians call the Third Army.
A relentless wave of smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and pneumonia.
To understand the mechanics of why this happens, we have to look closely at the logistical realities of post-war and post-collapse environments. When a conflict begins, a society's resources and attention are heavily diverted toward the military front.
But behind the lines, the invisible infrastructure that maintains public health is systematically compromised.
Exactly. Water treatment facilities and sanitation plants stop functioning due to a lack of maintenance or personnel.
Sewage systems begin leaking directly into the drinking water supply.
Supply chains fracture, meaning agricultural yields cannot reach urban centers. This leads to widespread malnutrition, which immediately suppresses the immune response of the general population.
And at the exact same time the population's immunity drops, their exposure to pathogens skyrockets. Families are displaced from their homes by violence or economic ruin and are forced to crowd into temporary, unsanitary shelters or refugee camps.
Hospitals lose power and run out of essential supplies. They transform from sanctuaries of healing into incubators for infection.
It creates a perfect, catastrophic storm for microbial life. When infrastructure weakens, bacteria multiply. Plagues historically follow sieges. Cholera inevitably follows displacement.
Influenza capitalizes on the global movement of troops. A horrifyingly perfect illustration of this dynamic is the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346.
Right. Kaffa was a prosperous Genovese trading outpost located on the Crimean Peninsula along the Black Sea.
And the Mongol army, representing a classic runaway train empire reliant on continuous expansion, laid siege to the heavily fortified city.
But during this protracted siege, the Mongol army's supply lines were strained. Their camps became crowded and unsanitary.
And they experienced a devastating epidemic of the bubonic plague right outside the city walls.
What the Mongol commanders did next was a chilling moment of tactical innovation that permanently altered global history. The Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi actually recorded the event in vivid detail.
Recognizing that their army was dying, the Mongols weaponized the biology that was destroying them.
They loaded the plague-infected corpses of their own dead soldiers onto their trebuchets and catapults and hurled them over the defensive walls into the city of Kaffa.
They effectively initiated one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare.
And the tactical maneuver was brutally effective. The rotting, infected corpses contaminated the air and water supply within the confined city.
The Genovese soldiers and merchants inside Kaffa rapidly contracted the disease. When the surviving merchants realized the city was doomed, they boarded their galleys and fled across the Black Sea.
They passed through the Bosphorus and eventually returned to the Mediterranean ports of Italy and North Africa. And in their holds, alongside their trade goods, They brought the Yersinia pestis bacterium.
And this specific event at Kaffa is widely credited with helping spark the Black Death, a pandemic that ultimately killed roughly 200 million people across Eurasia.
200 million.
The mortality rate was so profound that it took the European population more than 2 centuries to return to its pre-pandemic levels.
And the biological fallout from that single siege destabilized the entirety of European society. The massive loss of life upended the labor market, severely undermined the manorial system of feudalism, and deeply shook the spiritual authority of the church.
But the Black Death is just one instance of biology rewriting the political map. The sources point us back to the Antonine Plague, which ravaged the Roman Empire from 165 to 180 AD.
Demonstrating how disease exploits the very interconnectedness that makes an empire wealthy.
Right. The Antonine Plague demonstrates the fatal flaw in Tainter's House of Cards model when exposed to a pathogen. Rome had constructed an unprecedented network of trade routes, military highways, and dense urban centers.
And during campaigns in the Near East under the co-emperor Lucius Verus, Roman legions contracted a virulent disease.
Based on the meticulous descriptions provided by the Greek physician Galen,
He documented symptoms like high fever, violent coughing, blackish diarrhea.
vesicular skin eruptions that eventually scabbed over. Based on all that, modern epidemiologists strongly suspect this was a devastating outbreak of smallpox or perhaps measles.
And crucially, this pathogen struck what epidemiologists call a virgin population. The inhabitants of the Mediterranean and European provinces had no prior exposure to this specific virus.
Meaning there was zero built-up immunity within the population. The Roman troops, marching back along the very military highways built to project imperial power, unwittingly acted as vectors.
They carried the virus deep into the heart of the empire.
And Roman cities were uniquely vulnerable to a highly contagious respiratory or contact virus. Places like Rome and Alexandria were characterized by dense overcrowding.
Citizens were packed into multi-story insulate or apartment blocks.
They shared communal public baths and latrines, often suffered from poor baseline hygiene, and relied on a massive, complex grain dole that was highly sensitive to disruption.
So these cities rapidly became epicenters of mass mortality. Estimates suggest that between 1/3 to half of the empire's population perished.
Potentially up to 60 or 70 million people.
And a demographic hollowing out on that scale doesn't just cause widespread grief, it shatters the structural foundations of the state.
The Roman military lost so many experienced legionaries that the emperors were forced into desperate conscription measures.
They had to fill out the ranks with freed slaves, criminals, gladiators, and hastily hired German mercenaries.
This severe degradation in troop quality critically weakened Rome's ability to defend its sprawling borders, particularly along the highly volatile Rhine and Danube frontiers.
The economic devastation was equally profound. The sudden death of countless merchants and artisans disrupted the Mediterranean trade routes.
More importantly, the massive shortage of agricultural laborers led to a severe, protracted food crisis. Imperial revenues plummeted because there were simply fewer citizens to pay taxes.
So to cover the soaring costs of the military, the emperors began debasing the silver denarius, triggering rampant inflation.
An economic depression settled over the empire. The municipal aristocracies were hollowed out, and the psychological shock of the plague even shifted the religious landscape.
Right, Christians, who often stayed in the cities to nurse the sick while wealthy pagans fled to their country estates, won widespread public admiration.
Which significantly strengthened the position of this fringe monotheistic sect within a deeply polytheistic society.
Rome experienced a similar biological devastation centuries later during the Plague of Justinian in 541 to 542 AD.
Yeah, the Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople by Emperor Justinian, was at the absolute height of its power.
His armies, led by brilliant generals like Belisarius, were actively and successfully recapturing the lost territories of the Western Empire in North Africa and Italy. The Mediterranean was on the verge of becoming a Roman lake once again.
But then, the Yersinia pestis bacterium arrived, the exact same pathogen that would cause the Black Death 8 centuries later.
It likely traveled via grain ships from Egypt to Constantinople.
And the plague hit the imperial capital with terrifying ferocity, killing up to 10,000 people a day at its peak. The pandemic eventually swept across the empire, killing an estimated 30 to 50 million people.
It completely halted the Byzantine military reconquest in its tracks. The empire simply lacked the manpower and the financial resources to hold the newly conquered territories.
Furthermore, the ensuing labor shortage was so acute across the empire that powerful landowners were forced to offer immense concessions.
Effectively lending parcels of land to desperately needed laborers in exchange for a portion of their yield and military protection.
And this economic adaptation directly sowed the seeds of the feudal system that would dominate the Middle Ages.
So, synthesizing this historical data, civilizations do not fall only from external enemies. They fall when their internal systems cannot protect their people.
When an empire exhausts its resources on continuous expansion, internal political friction, or foreign invasions, it creates a massive structural vulnerability.
The supply chains fracture, the water systems degrade.
And this inevitable decay invites diseases that rapidly accelerate the societal decline. War and neglect destabilize the society, and biology finishes the job.
Now, listening to this today, situated in the modern world, it is incredibly easy to dismiss this as ancient history.
We always do. We think that was ancient Rome, that was the Middle Ages.
We possess modern medical science, we have sterile hospitals, vaccines, and most importantly, we have antibiotics.
But the medical reports in our sources pose a chilling question. What happens when the closet of antibiotics is empty?
That scenario is not a dystopian fiction. It is the most terrifying and pressing reality presented in our scientific sources.
We are currently living through a silent, escalating pandemic. It is a crisis largely ignored by the general public, overshadowed by more immediate geopolitical conflicts. But it is deeply feared by the global medical community.
We're talking about antimicrobial resistance, commonly referred to as AMR.
The era of the miracle drug is rapidly coming to an end. Ever since Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, antibiotics have functioned as the foundational backbone of modern medicine.
They fundamentally altered the human lifespan, turning previously fatal infections like strep throat or minor infected wounds into minor inconveniences. They've saved hundreds of millions of lives.
But as we established earlier, biology never negotiates, and it never stops evolving. The data is deeply alarming.
Globally, right now, 1 in 6 bacterial infections exhibits resistance to standard first-line antibiotics.
To truly grasp the gravity of the AMR crisis, we have to look closely at the statistics emerging from regions that are currently carrying a heavy burden of infectious disease.
The reports from India, for instance, provide a harrowing preview of a post-antibiotic world.
It is currently estimated that 58,000 neonatal deaths,
58,000 newborn babies,
occur in India each year simply because the bacterial infections they contract in their first days of life are resistant to all first-line antibiotics.
That is a staggering, heartbreaking human cost for a biological crisis that is entirely of our own making.
So how exactly did we create this global army of superbugs?
The common narrative usually blames patients demanding antibiotics for a viral cold or local doctors overprescribing Z-Paks.
And while human misuse in clinical settings is a major factor, the sources reveal it is only a fraction of the problem.
The roots of the AMR crisis are deeply embedded in industrial agricultural abuse and catastrophic environmental pollution.
The epidemiological reports stress that antibiotic resistance is driven by human behavior across massive systemic levels. Consider the global agricultural industry.
We currently use thousands of tons of antibiotics in livestock farming. These drugs are not just administered to treat individual sick animals.
They are routinely mixed into the feed and water of entire herds and flocks as prophylactics, to prevent diseases from spreading in incredibly overcrowded, unsanitary factory farming conditions.
Furthermore, low doses of antibiotics are used simply because they promote faster physical growth in the animals, increasing profit margins.
And those massive quantities of drugs don't just vanish after the animal consumes them.
The environmental consequences are profound and largely unregulated. The sludge, runoff, and manure generated by these massive agricultural operations are absolutely saturated with active antibiotic compounds.
Things like ciprofloxacin, oxytetracycline, doxycycline, and sulfadiazine. These compounds leach directly into the soil and the local groundwater.
And the situation is exacerbated by the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry itself.
The effluent, the liquid waste discharged from pharmaceutical plants, is frequently heavily contaminated with the very active ingredients they're producing.
The sources cite environmental testing conducted in India, a major hub for global pharmaceutical manufacturing. Tests of wastewater systems near these facilities have shown that the pharmaceutical plant effluent contains active antibiotic concentrations up to 1 million times higher than what is found in typical municipal wastewater.
1 million times higher.
We are quite literally dumping oceans of active antibiotics directly into the global ecosystem.
And what this does is transform rivers, soils, and groundwater into massive planetary-scale training grounds for bacteria.
The biological mechanism at play here is fundamental Darwinian evolution, accelerated to terrifying speeds.
When you expose a massive population of bacteria to a constant low-level dose of antibiotics, the weaker, susceptible bacteria are killed off.
But the strong ones, the statistical outliers that possess random genetic mutations allowing them to survive the drug, they live.
With the competition eliminated, they multiply exponentially.
And this is where bacterial biology becomes truly frightening. Bacteria do not just pass down these resistance traits vertically to their offspring.
They possess the ability to engage in horizontal gene transfer. They can physically share these resistance genes, often located on small DNA molecules called plasmids, directly with neighboring bacteria.
They can even share these resistance mechanisms across entirely different species of bacteria.
A harmless environmental bacterium in a polluted river can develop resistance and then transfer that genetic armor to a highly dangerous human pathogen like E. coli or Klebsiella.
This means we are actively, systematically selecting for the most indestructible, lethal bugs on the planet.
Which brings us back to the issue of human prescription behaviors, specifically the rampant misuse of antibiotics for viral infections.
Right. Antibiotics are designed to target bacterial cell walls or bacterial proteins that do absolutely nothing against viruses.
But when a patient takes an antibiotic for a viral flu, that drug enters their system and indiscriminately wipes out their good germs.
The billions of beneficial bacteria residing in the human microbiome that aid in digestion and actively keep pathogenic bacteria in check by competing for resources.
When you kill off your good germs, you effectively clear the biological battlefield. If a drug-resistant superbug is present, it suddenly has all the room, nutrients, and resources it needs to expand rapidly and take over the host's body.
The danger of these superinfections was starkly highlighted during recent global events. The sources suggest we must view the COVID-19 pandemic not just as a singular crisis, but as a grim dress rehearsal for the collision of viral pandemics with the AMR crisis.
The reports contain a deeply concerning data point. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, over 50% of the deaths among patients who were hospitalized and placed on mechanical ventilators were not caused directly by the virus itself.
Those deaths were the consequence of secondary superimposed bacterial infections that the patients acquired in the hospital.
And critically, many of those secondary infections were highly resistant to the antibiotics doctors used to treat them.
The virus compromised the patient's immune system. The mechanical ventilator provided a direct physical pathway into the lungs, and the antibiotic-resistant bacteria present in the hospital environment delivered the fatal blow.
The medical reports note that in the desperate early days of the outbreak, physicians understandably attacked the unknown respiratory distress with heavy, broad-spectrum combinations of antibiotics.
While done to save lives, this massive surge in antibiotic usage in hospitals globally drove resistance rates up even further.
If we cross the threshold where we lose the efficacy of our antimicrobials entirely, the systemic consequences are almost unimaginable to the modern mind.
We are not merely talking about the risk of dying from a scraped knee or a minor infection, though that certainly returns as a grim possibility. We are talking about the complete collapse of modern medicine as an interconnected system.
Every routine procedure we take for granted becomes a life-threatening gamble. Cesarean sections, joint replacements like hips and knees, cancer chemotherapy, which suppresses the immune system, organ transplants, which require lifelong immunosuppressants, the survival of premature infants in neonatal intensive care units.
Every single one of these medical miracles relies absolutely on our underlying ability to reliably prevent and treat bacterial infections. If the antibiotics fail, the foundational safety net of modern healthcare vanishes.
The source material quotes a prominent infectious disease expert who states, "A pandemic disease is the most predictable catastrophe in the history of the human race."
History, as we discussed with Rome and Kaffa, guarantees that new pathogens will emerge.
But when the next major pandemic hits, it will not occur in a biological vacuum. It will collide head-on with the silent, deeply entrenched crisis of antimicrobial resistance.
The defining characteristic of the next global health crisis may well be the catastrophic wave of untreatable secondary bacterial infections that follow the initial viral surge.
If biology is indeed ruthless, and our primary medical arsenal is rapidly depleting, a crucial question emerges. What factors dictate who survives and who perishes when these biological threats materialize?
To answer this, our deep dive must shift from the microbiology of the hospital back out to the macro systems that govern our societies. We have to examine the critical perspective of Dr. Paul Farmer on the nature of emerging infectious diseases.
Paul Farmer was a deeply influential medical anthropologist and physician whose field experience fundamentally challenged the traditional narratives of epidemiology.
He argued with rigorous data from places like Haiti and Peru that epidemics do not simply happen in a vacuum. A pathogen may be biological, but the trajectory of an epidemic is powerfully, inevitably sculpted by social inequalities.
Traditional epidemiological models historically focus very narrowly on individual risk behaviors, analyzing what a specific person ate, where they traveled, or their personal hygiene habits.
But Farmer insisted that this narrow view obscures the truth. He demanded we utilize a critical epistemology.
Meaning, we must analyze the massive underlying social, historical, and economic forces that place unequally positioned individuals in the path of a pathogen.
Farmer's central thesis is that diseases systematically hide among the poor and the marginalized.
When public health services are privatized and moved out of reach of the working class, or when foundational public infrastructure like clean water and sanitation is simply lacking in marginalized neighborhoods, diseases that are entirely preventable or treatable become localized death sentences.
The texts we are examining carefully detail Farmer's critique of macro-level economic policies to illustrate this point.
He analyzed how policies mandated by international financial institutions, such as the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and the IMF in the late 20th century, often required developing nations to drastically cut public health spending and privatize clinical services in exchange for loan bailouts.
Farmer demonstrated that these socioeconomic obstacles and the resulting deepening of poverty were the leading drivers of disease spread in those regions.
He pointed out the glaring reality that the groups most at risk for many infectious diseases are bounded far more strictly by their socioeconomic status than by their geographic latitude.
The sources provide a striking historical example of this dynamic right in the United States. The history of malaria.
Today, we culturally categorize malaria strictly as a tropical disease, something that only exists near the equator.
But in the 19th century, malaria was endemic across much of the United States. It absolutely devastated the Ohio River Valley, causing seasonal epidemics that killed thousands of settlers and citizens every year.
The eradication of malaria in the United States is incredibly instructive. It was ultimately defeated not primarily by pharmaceutical breakthroughs or clinical treatments, but by massive localized infrastructure improvements.
Malaria was driven out by extensive land drainage projects that eliminated mosquito breeding grounds, the implementation of better housing standards, the widespread installation of window screens,
and eventually the electrification that allowed for the use of fans to disrupt mosquito flight paths inside homes.
But the critical point tying this back to Farmer's thesis is that initially, only the wealthy could afford those infrastructural protections.
Only the affluent could afford to build homes with tight-fitting window screens or to purchase land in drained, elevated areas.
Consequently, the disease didn't disappear evenly. It became heavily concentrated among impoverished populations living in low-lying, poorly drained areas in substandard housing.
The physical infrastructure acts as a literal shield against biology. And when that shield is unevenly distributed across a society based on wealth, disease ruthlessly exploits the gaps.
This deep vulnerability in physical infrastructure is precisely why innovative technological responses attempting to bypass overburdened traditional systems are so crucial.
Our sources highlight the fascinating work of Dr. Srivatsa, who developed an application called MEA, which stands for Medical Advice You Access.
This app addresses a fatal flaw in how we historically respond to outbreaks. During a pandemic or even a severe, localized epidemic, the natural human instinct is to seek medical help.
Symptomatic individuals travel directly to hospitals or localized clinics to get tested or treated.
It seems entirely logical on an individual level. If you were deeply sick, you go to the place where the doctors are.
But from a macro epidemiological perspective, it is a logistical disaster. Think about the mechanics of that movement.
Those highly contagious individuals are traveling on crowded public transport, walking through dense urban areas, sitting for hours in packed waiting rooms, and interacting closely with frontline healthcare workers.
By seeking care, they inadvertently transform hospitals, which are supposed to be secure sanctuaries of healing, into super spreader hubs of infection.
The healthcare workers inevitably get sick. The hospital's capacity is overwhelmed, the staff is decimated, and the local medical system collapses under the weight of the very people trying to access it.
This is where Dr. Srivatsa's MEA app intervenes. It functions as a remote triage tool, creating a digital infrastructure to replace physical movement.
Patients input their specific symptoms from the isolation of their own homes. The system evaluates their condition and provides immediate guidance.
Crucially, the vast majority of patients can be advised on how to safely isolate and manage their symptoms at home, receiving necessary medical advice without ever stepping foot outside their door, reserving clinic visits strictly for absolute emergencies.
It is a brilliant infrastructural adaptation to a biological threat. By keeping the mildly and moderately infected isolated in their homes, the app actively protects the broader community from exposure.
More importantly, it preserves the functional capacity and the supply chain of the healthcare system. It acts as a pressure valve, stopping the hospital from becoming the epicenter of the outbreak and ensuring that the internal systems that protect life do not buckle when they are needed most.
So, tracing our path through these sources, we have examined the 340-year lifespans of empires and Tanger's models of how their internal complexity eventually crushes them.
We've seen the historical devastation of diseases like the Antonine Plague finishing the job after war destabilizes an empire.
We've explored the terrifying modern reality of antimicrobial resistance, where our agricultural and environmental hubris is emptying the antibiotic closet.
And we've seen through Paul Farmer's eyes how social inequality dictates the path of these epidemics.
Modern humans often act as if we are entirely separate from nature. We build our political structures and economic markets as if they exist in a vacuum, completely immune to the rules of biology.
But our sources take us into a completely different, profound realm to show us just how deeply interconnected this all is. We are now turning to the ancient wisdom of Vedic philosophy and its astonishing intersections with modern theoretical physics.
This final section of the deep dive truly transcends human history and clinical medicine, moving into the fundamental mechanical laws of reality itself.
The sages, philosophers, and academics who compiled the ancient Vedic texts recognized the universal existence of an organizing principle they called Raita.
Raita. What exactly does that concept encompass?
Raita is conceptualized as the unseen, fundamental cosmic law that maintains the orderly structure of the multifaceted universe. It is an impersonal, immutable force existing entirely outside of human control or negotiation.
It dictates the behavior of the physical world, the movement of the stars, the changing of the seasons, as well as the moral and ethical world of human action.
In the Vedic philosophical system, recognizing Raita and adhering to Dharma, which is the moral imperative and duty to act in alignment with that cosmic law, are the paramount goals of existence.
A central feature of this Vedic system, and a term that has heavily permeated modern language, is the concept of karma.
In casual Western conversation, karma is often reduced to a simplistic idea of cosmic revenge, a mystical tally of good and bad deeds where a supernatural force punishes you for cutting someone off in traffic.
But that reduction completely misses the profound structural nature of the concept. In deep Indian philosophy, karma is strictly defined as the ultimate, inescapable law of cause and effect.
It is a universal mechanical law that all beings and systems must abide by. The universe, guided by Raita, does not possess a mind to actively punish. It simply responds mathematically to conditions.
Every action inevitably generates an equal and corresponding reaction. If a civilization acts in a way that disrupts the harmony and equilibrium of the universe will automatically rebalance itself.
It is not a vengeful deity sitting on a cloud passing judgment. It is the mechanical, inevitable process of cosmic equilibrium asserting itself.
What makes this ancient philosophical framework so compelling in our sources is how flawlessly it maps onto the discoveries of modern theoretical physics, particularly the laws of thermodynamics.
The parallels are striking. In physics, the first law of thermodynamics dictates that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed from one state to another.
The second law introduces the concept of entropy, the universal, inexorable tendency of all closed systems to move toward chaos, disorder, and decay.
The physicist Erwin Schrödinger, in his famous lectures on What is Life, explained that living organisms maintain their complex order, a temporary state of low entropy, by constantly consuming energy from their environment and expelling higher entropy waste.
We are essentially little fragile pockets of complex order fighting a constant battle in a universe that is mathematically trending toward chaos.
Precisely. And this localized battle against entropy scales up to the planetary level. The Gaia hypothesis, pioneered by scientists James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, proposes that the Earth itself functions as a massive, deeply interconnected, self-regulating system.
The complex feedback loops between all living organisms and their inorganic environment actively regulate global conditions, such as surface temperature, ocean salinity, and atmospheric composition, to maintain the precise stability required to support complex life.
The Earth constantly adjusts to maintain its equilibrium.
It is a massive, biological, self-correcting system. So when we connect this theoretical physics and ancient philosophy back to the harsh realities of our earlier historical and medical data, the picture becomes incredibly clear.
If the Earth is a self-regulating biological system, and the law of karma, cause and effect, dictates that every action demands a reaction, what happens when human civilizations act like tainters runaway trains?
What happens when we pump massive amounts of carbon pollution into the atmosphere, relentlessly destroy complex habitats, and dump millions of tons of active pharmaceutical antibiotics into the global water supply?
The system self-corrects. It balances the equation. We have severely disrupted the microscopic equilibrium of the planet.
For the last century, humanity operated under the hubristic assumption that we could wage a continuous, one-sided war of annihilation against bacteria using antibiotics, and that there would be no biological blowback.
But the universe responds to conditions. The emergence of antimicrobial-resistant superbugs is not a divine punishment for our sins. It is a direct mathematical, biological response to our actions.
We drastically altered the chemical environment of the planet, and nature is simply balancing the equation by rapidly evolving bacteria that can survive and thrive in that new environment.
It is the dinosaur model of societal collapse playing out on a microscopic biological scale.
We are rapidly depleting our miracle drug resources, but instead of fundamentally adapting our agricultural systems or our relationship with the natural world, we just keep synthesizing and pumping out heavier antibiotics, hoping the biological reality will simply go away. We act as if we are separate from the rules.
Our sources from the realm of theoretical physics note that modern science is currently consumed by the search for a theory of everything, a single, elegant mathematical framework that can unite the macro world of general relativity with the micro world of quantum mechanics.
Interestingly, ancient Hindu sages viewed the cosmos through a remarkably similar lens of ultimate unity.
They taught that all the visible diversity, separation, and conflict in the world is the result of illusion, a concept called avidya. They believed the only true underlying reality is a unified, interconnected supreme spirit, or Brahman.
There's a beautiful narrative from the ancient Chandogya Upanishad included in our sources that perfectly illustrates this concept of invisible unity. A father, seeking to teach his son about the invisible nature of reality, instructs the boy to place a solid lump of salt into a large bowl of water and leave it overnight.
The next morning, the father asks the son to bring him the lump of salt. The son looks into the bowl, but the solid salt has completely dissolved. He cannot find it.
The father then instructs him to taste the water from the surface of the bowl. "How is it?" the father asks. "It is salt," the son replies.
The father tells him to take a sip from the middle of the bowl and then from the very bottom. Everywhere the son tastes, the water is thoroughly imbued with salt.
The father then imparts the lesson. "Here also, in this body indeed, you do not perceive the true, my son, but there indeed it is."
It is a stunningly accurate analogy for the universal laws we've discussed today. You cannot see the law of gravity. You cannot physically see the laws of thermodynamics operating.
You cannot see the genetic plasmids transferring resistance between bacteria in a polluted river in real time. But these laws and mechanisms are entirely dissolved into the fabric of our reality.
They dictate the outcome of every single action, from the fall of Rome to the struggle in a modern neonatal intensive care unit.
Just as modern theoretical physicists look for the invisible mathematical patterns and laws that dictate the assembly of atoms and the rotation of galaxies, the ancient philosophers understood that an invisible order, reta, permeates every single drop of the universe.
When human civilizations violate that underlying order, whether through the blind hubris of endless military empire building, the callous neglect of public health infrastructure for the poor, or the short-sighted abuse of medical science and agriculture, the massive system inevitably reacts.
Which brings the massive cosmic scope of this deep dive right back down to our immediate modern reality. We began by asking how civilizations actually fall.
We learned from Kemp, Tainter, and Diamond that they do not fall merely from external enemies or singular cinematic events.
They fall when their internal systems, heavily burdened by complexity and inequality, can no longer protect their people. This is the brutal lesson repeated across centuries, from the sprawling Roman frontiers to the besieged walls of Kaffa to the crowded clinics of the modern world.
War, political rigidity, and societal neglect destabilize our infrastructure. The water systems fail, the supply chains fracture.
This vulnerability inevitably invites disease, which ruthlessly accelerates our decline.
The universe does not punish. It simply responds to conditions. The question for any nation today, and really the fundamental question for you to consider as you observe the world around you, is simple. Are our actions and our policies strengthening the internal systems that protect life, or are we actively weakening them?
Because biology never negotiates, and microbes do not recognize human borders. A multi-drug-resistant superbug forged in the agricultural runoff of one continent can travel the globe in a matter of hours on a commercial flight.
Civilizations do not fall only from external enemies. They collapse when their internal rot provides biology an opening. History does not repeat itself by accident. It repeats when we willfully forget the fundamental laws of cause and effect.
We have journeyed through the 340-year lifespan of empires, the lethal reality of post-war epidemics, the looming crisis of antimicrobial resistance, the profound impact of social inequality on human survival, and the cosmic laws of karma and thermodynamics. But as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final mind-bending thought to mull over on your own.
It builds directly on the physics and philosophy we just discussed. In exploring our scientific sources, we encounter the work of theoretical cosmologist Frank Tipler and his highly controversial, deeply fascinating omega point theory.
Tipler's omega point theory is a profound conceptual leap. Using the frameworks of quantum mechanics and information theory, Tipler suggests that the ultimate, distant evolution of the universe is moving inevitably toward a single, unified, infinitely intelligent system.
In this highly theoretical view, the entire universe will eventually organize itself into a state consisting entirely of interconnected, intelligent thought processes. It is the ultimate culmination of complex order triumphing over entropy.
If our individual human consciousness is just a temporary ripple in a vast cosmic ocean, exactly as the Vedic sages believed thousands of years ago, perhaps the next necessary evolutionary step for human survival isn't technological at all.
Perhaps the answer to our vulnerability isn't about engineering a better weapon to fight our neighbors, or even discovering a new, stronger antibiotic to briefly hold back the microbial tide.
Maybe the only way to avoid the fate of the Romans and the Mongols is a fundamental shift toward a unified planetary consciousness. Will we learn to see ourselves as a single, deeply interconnected organism, humanity, nature, and the invisible microbial world, all existing as part of one delicate, essential balance in time to save our civilization?
Or will we stubbornly refuse to adapt, succumb to the biology that has always governed us, and become just another 340-year layer in the fossil record for future archaeologists to dig up?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll leave you with that lingering question.